Ani, Sego, greetings, everyone. Welcome to a chat with Duke Redbird and David Crombie. In our traditional way, we always like to start every meeting with a land acknowledgement, and I'd like to share with you this poem, which is a land acknowledgement. It's called A Dish with One Spoon. The Mississauga Nation welcomed settlers from across the seas when they arrived in their territories. Such beauty revealed before their eyes was beyond their ability to describe. In all the languages that the settlers spoke, there were no words that could evoke with any clarity a single thought that Mother Nature's splendor brought. It was from the indigenous tongues that the settlers learned the language of the earth in all her idioms. Toronto, from Takaranto, trees standing in the water, a meeting place where small fish could gather. Nearby hills where alders grow, that was called Etobicoke. And in the autumn, before the winter snows, the passenger pigeons rested in Mimico. And to the west, where the great waters flow, the lake and lands were called Ontario. Eagles soar high with prayers for Manitou. The Mississauga people smudge and launch their birch bark canoes. Three sisters, corn, bean, and squash, the planting season has begun. Tobacco is offered a gift to grandmother's son. Sage, sweetgrass, and cedar to grandmother moon. There is peace, joy, and harmony in the treaty lands called A Dish with One Spoon. Megwetch.
Thank you so much, Duke. So wonderful to see you as always. Good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Diamond, and as CEO of Museum, Toronto's Museum Without Walls, I want to welcome everybody to Wigwam Chichimang in conversation with Duke Redbird and David Crombie. This series of events has taken different forms over the past 18 months, including outdoor programming last year at Trillium Park at Ontario Place, an intimate Ask an Elder online conversations this past summer with Duke, and today on Zoom with truly two icons, Duke and David. We hope that you're settled into your home, your office, an outdoor space underneath an umbrella in Toronto to enjoy what promises to be an enlightening discussion. A not-for-profit organization since 2014, Museum is your Toronto museum. Our engaging programs and experiences showcase the history, the spaces, the cultures, the architecture, and the people that represent our city's unique place in the world. But Museum is not just one place, it's every place in the city. You can experience Museum programs all year long in exhibits, online, at pop-up events around the GTA, and gain a new perspective of stories of the city, including some of the untold and underrepresented themes that make up our historical narrative. Elder Duke Redbird and former Mayor David Crombie have a long history together through their many contributions to the City of Toronto. This unique conversation between two iconic figures will explore the history of Toronto and its waterfront from pre-contact 12,000 years ago until today, taking us on a historical journey that includes personal observations, anecdotes, and their incredible wealth of knowledge when it comes to Indigenous-Settler relations. It's now my pleasure to reintroduce Duke Redbird. Duke is a longtime partner and such a special friend of Museum. Most of us know Duke for the impact that he has made in his many years as an intellectual, a poet, a painter, a broadcaster, a filmmaker, and a keynote speaker. But I consider Duke first and foremost a teacher, one who has been instrumental in implementing Indigenous approaches to art education, to community engagement, and really just making the world around him and around us a better place. Do we continue to be honored by your presence, your generosity, and your partnership? I also am thrilled to welcome our good friend David Crombie today. David has served as Mayor of Toronto, a Member of Parliament, a federal cabinet minister. He's also served as President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute, the chair of Ontario Place, the founding chair of the Waterfront Regeneration Trust, chancellor of Ryerson University, and the chair of the Toronto Lands Corporation. He is a member of the Order of Ontario and an officer of the Order of Canada. But perhaps even more impressive than any of that, he's also a Museum of Toronto co-founder and former board director. David, it's so wonderful to see you again. I would now like to throw it over to Audra Santa. Passionate about elevating Indigenous voices in a variety of settings, Audra is the manager of strategy and partnerships with the Downey Wenjack Fund and is dedicated to bridging connections as a musician, a facilitator, and an advocate. But today she has the tall task of acting as our moderator for this discussion. So I'll throw it over to you, Audra. Welcome to you as well.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. And it is a tall task because when you have two people who have a history that spans decades together to have a conversation for 60 minutes plus some questions, it's going to take a little bit of us just guiding that through because there's so much we get to learn. I'm so excited to be here. Both Duke Redbird and David Crombie are two incredible people that have such an amazing history together and individually in the work that they've done, both to understand the waterfront, the lands that we're on, and also the history of Indigenous and settler relations. And I'm so excited about it. So I hope you are too. There's a few things that we can do together to ensure that we get the best out of this experience. So a few little housekeeping tips before we start. If you want to view all speakers, when that happened, I just lost my notes. If you'd like to view all speakers on the same screen, we just ask that you would open up your Zoom in gallery view. So when you go up to the top right-hand corner, there should be an option there to view all speakers at once. Also, closed captions are available. If you'd like to turn on the closed captioning, there's a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to show subtitles. And if you use the Q&A function, that's going to be a really great way for us to actually bring questions into the conversation. There are a couple hundred people on this call, so if you put questions just in the chat, we might miss them. But if you go down to the bottom of the screen, there's Q&A. And right there, you can add your questions in. You can vote up questions that you really like and you'd like to hear answered. But if you do have things you just want to comment on or chat, I encourage you to use the chat box. In there, Myseum will also be sharing some helpful tips, some information, some resources, and they'll be able to support our learning further there. So thanks so much to Myseum for creating such an awesome learning experience for us. And I think most importantly, what we'd really like to do to ensure we get the most out of this conversation is to listen with our hearts. Every time I have the opportunity to hear from Duke, I walk away with my knowledge and my understanding expanded so much. But when I actually choose to listen from here, it will transform me in a different way where I'm able to walk differently, where the future that we create together can be even better. And that's the thing with both Duke and David. They're going to share history from 12,000 years ago to the present day that we're in, giving us that context, but then also the future of what we can do together. As two incredible, incredible people. As you know, like Duke has the history as a poet, broadcaster, artist, so much. And David as well, he was known as the tiny, perfect mayor of Toronto, but has also been working hard around understanding how to best use waterfront lands. And their combined knowledge and history together brings so much to the table. So welcome, Duke and David. We'd love for you to start with a little bit of understanding of when you first started this work together. I think it was in the 1970s.
Well, as I recall, it was 1968, I think, when Ryerson introduced the idea of wanting to talk about Indigenous culture and the diversity of Toronto. And David Crombie invited me to be a guest speaker, and I made a speech. I was an activist in those days. There wasn't much known by the citizens of Toronto about the history of Toronto. It was everyone had thought that it started with the War of 1812, but of course Toronto goes back a long, long way, and it was a real beginning of a dialogue that has gone on for all these many years through some very difficult times. During the 60s and the civil rights movement in the United States and the war in Vietnam, we were welcoming our American brothers to in Toronto and trying to get them established. They were called draft dodgers, but they thought of themselves as people that were defending democracy in North America and not interfering with other countries. They were fine people, and many of the American young people that came over during the 60s stayed in Toronto and developed businesses, and they were quite an active group of people, and we were all young. We were looking to a future that we thought that as a hippie generation that I was a part of, as David was the same world that we engaged in, and we were active. We were marching against the weapons and the war, and we were marching for civil rights. We were doing all kinds of wonderful things, and that's how I remember my first encounter with David, who was an activist on a completely different level, but one that we shared the same, I think, the same aspirations of wanting to see a better world for the future of our children and grandchildren.
Well, you were really both revolutionaries, still are. And I think I remember David was telling me, I think, David, you said that it was really the white paper that helped trigger bringing Duke into the classroom. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that is right. Duke's right, though, that it was on in 1968. I was teaching at Ryerson, and in those days, Ryerson had there was a tremendous opportunity of freedom of inquiry. So you could pretty well teach where you thought students wanted to go. And so that allowed us to try and deal with the explosion of new people coming to Toronto that have been going on for 20 years. But now was an attempt to try and understand it as we began to get more Americans, more Quebecers, and more Africans, South Africans. So it was in that context to try and understand what has become multicultural Toronto, to take a look at that. One of the things that was clear was that we had this bias in our education system that somehow there was no history before Simcoe, that it all began when he floated into Toronto Bay. But there were other people who were taking an interest in seeing Toronto's history earlier than that, and I was in touch with them. And so we had an interest in understanding Indigenous history of Toronto. Secondly, that was increased enthusiasm by the white paper. And Duke may want to talk about the white paper because, in my judgment, the production of the white paper in 1969 by the federal government, which was an attempt to assimilate and integrate Indigenous culture and peoples into Canada, which they thought with a good heart was the right thing to do. It became the watershed moment that we're still on. And that is, in my sense, my feeling, a renaissance of understanding the historic role of Indigenous people in Toronto and in the country. And it was that white paper which was reacted to violently strongly by Indigenous people. Harold Cardinal, wonderful Treaty 8 Indigenous person from Alberta, wrote a book called The Unjust Society, Equality Plus, and the writers and artists and activists within, including Duke, began then to change our understanding. And it's still going on. So it was a great time to live, by the way, because there was a fervent in the place. And I might say when Duke showed up in class with his usual regalia, he was a pretty scary looking guy. No, he was he just looked marvelous, and he sounded marvelous, and people were captured, as I am still.
Wonderful. Well, as a bit of context, the white paper that came out, that was, for those who don't understand, Myceum might be able to put some information in, but that was essentially a policy proposal to do away with the Indian Act and to further assimilate Indigenous people into the Eurocentric culture, the dominant. And so that was really that uprising and that history. And I think connecting with the history of the fact that there's 12,000 years before that weren't being acknowledged is a big part of it. So I was wondering if, Duke, maybe you can even tell us a bit about like the history of the waterfront and how we know that there's so much evidence of pre-contact of people being on the land before contact.
Well, yes. If we start with the white paper, which fired up myself, and Harold Cardinal is a good friend of mine, and it came out of the Liberal government with their the Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Came out with a document that said the Just Society, and the Just Society assumed that the Indigenous people would welcome assimilation into the dominant culture, and that assumption was so far off the mark. The last thing that our people wanted was any assimilation. That fired up in our consciousness. We are going to disappear if we assimilate. And we also were asking what kind of government in 1867, just 100 years ago, formed a government and did not invite Indigenous people into confederation. We weren't even invited to the party. Whether we would have wanted, whether our leaders of the time would have wanted to be a member of Confederation, or would we have wanted to stay with what our treaties claimed that we wanted was an independent, self-governing, self-determining people that we had always been. And there was evidence that we'd been here for at least 12,000 years, because in 1908, a dredging crew at the bottom of Bay Street discovered in the blue clay under the dredging machines that were dredging out, and they discovered hundreds of tracks, moccasin-clad footprints walking through the area at the foot of Bay Street. And that proved without a shadow of a doubt that our people have been here for at least that long, but we since know that we've been, human habitation has existed in North America, South America, as we called Turtle Island, North America, for at least 100,000 years, because they found evidence of saber-toothed tigers and mammoths that were being butchered and eaten and by human beings in North America 100,000 years ago. So when we come up to at least 12,000 years ago, you would have thought that the Canadian settler population would have embraced that and said, wow, we're not just a couple hundred years old. We have a heritage available to us going all the way back to the 12,000 years ago. And there was a great philosopher his name was Hegel. Hegel said that the blank pages of history are those periods of time when there was peace upon the land. And if you look at the world of North America before the settlers came, we had no armies, no police forces, no prisons, no institutions of power or money. we were a peaceful people living along the waterfront of downtown Toronto in peace and harmony. And we were virtually a blank page to the settlers who arrived in the 17th century.
Wow. I know, David, you spoke of a book by Ron Williamson, which also helped you to understand this history even more.
For sure. Ron is, of course, an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist, but he combined natural heritage and cultural heritage. And anybody who wants a kind of quick but thoughtful understanding of 12,000 years of Toronto history should read Ron Williamson's book called The 12,000 Years of Toronto. 12,000 Years of Toronto. That history was lost. Was lost essentially after the War of 1812, not to get into too much of historical weeds, but the power structure in North America between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people was quite a balance up until the War of 1812. After that, the whole notion of what to do and how to approach Indigenous culture was to assimilate it. So when the White Paper came in 1969, Prime Minister Trudeau at the time and Jean Chrétien, who was the minister of then called Indian and Northern Affairs, produced the White Paper. They thought they were bringing to a close a public policy of assimilation, when in fact, that's what they did. What they thought they were doing was opening up a new chapter. That new chapter was entirely the opposite of what they intended, because within a couple of years, it became clear that there was a whole new understanding of what Canadian relationships were with Indigenous people. Up until the 69, 70, we had the policy of assimilation, and in 1876, the Indian Department, the Indian Act, was established in order to facilitate that assimilation. So, yeah, that's what the Indian Act was to do. The idea that we were to, through the residential schools, through a whole bunch of policies, was to assimilate Indigenous people. In short, the quote from the minister in 1908 was called "Getting the Indianness out of the Indian." Now, that's what it was called. So it was clear we were now moving beyond assimilation. That was unacceptable. And we began to move into a new relationship. And let me put this in. When I became minister of what was then called Indian Northern Affairs, in Ottawa, in official Ottawa, the relationship between Aboriginal people or Indigenous people and Canada was the Indian Act. If you went out into Indigenous country, went into reserves, went and talked to even Inuit and Métis people, they said, no, the relationship is with the treaties. So it was really, by the time, in the early 70s, shortly after the act, there was a court case called the Calder case in British Columbia, which said there was a color of right that needed to be negotiated with the Quebec Cree people and also with the Nisga'a people in the Nass Valley in British Columbia. Those court cases allowed the Supreme Court to give life to the idea of the treaties. Today, 60 years later, we now clearly understand that our relationship is not with the Indian Act. Our relationship is with those treaties, and it's trying to understand the meaning and impact of those treaties that covers today's public dialogue. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was muted for a moment there. There's some really great resources out there for people. My CM, I know, will be sending an email, but whosland.ca helps us to look at some of the treaties as well. I just grabbed this off my bookshelf, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. A great book, because a lot of us aren't as aware about the Indian Act as we could and should be. And then also understanding that treaties are very different depending on, every treaty was significant and unique that was negotiated there. So
the difficulty with the treaty relationship, and this is where remember, the Indigenous people were an oral people and with an oral culture, and we made agreements that when the lawyers and the policymakers got a hold of those treaties were written down with the stroke of a pen. The stroke of a pen virtually erased any of the ideas that were associated with the treaty agreements that took place. And the War of 1812 is particularly significant in the sense that what was the world like in during the War of 1812 when the Indigenous people were allies to the British Crown and actually fought on the side of the British Crown in order to protect us or to enable the Canada to remain in British hands. The British had made a treaty and a proclamation of 1863, which said that no one could move into Indigenous territories without their agreement, and so there was a war of 1812, and one of the great chiefs of the War of 1812, his name was Black Hawk, and he fought on the side of the British. And at a meeting, he made a great speech to the British authorities that he was an ally to. And this is what he said: "The Great Spirit gave to us a world that was composed of the finest and best land for our home and use. The woods and prairies teemed with buffalo, moose, elk, bear, and deer, with other game suitable for our enjoyment, while the lakes, rivers, creeks, and ponds were alive with the very best kinds of fish for our food. The islands were our gardens, where the Great Spirit caused berries, plums, and other fruits to grow in great abundance, while the soil, when cultivated, produced corn, bean, pumpkins, and squash on the finest and largest quantities. Our children were never known to cry of hunger, and no stranger, red or white, was permitted to enter our lodges without finding food and rest. The Great Spirit created this country for the use and benefit of his children and placed them in full possession of it, and we were happy and contented." And that was the allyship between the British military authorities and the Indigenous people. When the military moved out and turned the authority over to the civil authorities, they immediately decided to starve the Indigenous people, take our children, place them into residential schools, and deny us of any of the rights and privileges of what the Great Spirit had delivered to us. And on top of that, they decided to create a department, imagine, a Department of Indian Affairs to solve the Indian problem. Not unlike what the Germans did during the Second World War, creating a Department of Jewish Affairs and assigning them to concentration camps. Only ours were called prisons of grass and continued to operate under a ministry called the Department of Indigenous Affairs. There's no Department of Polish Affairs or English Affairs or French Affairs. Only our people are consigned to that. And we have no self-determination, and we lost it by being allies to the British. And it continues today. However, in Toronto, I must say, the Mississauga people and the City of Toronto in 1805 came to an accommodation. And in that accommodation, there was treaties that were signed and they were fulfilled, and the people adhered to them. Now, it took from 1805 to 2008 or 10 for the City of Toronto to finally make a restitution of an incredible $145 million for the entire treaty lands of Dish with One Spoon, which includes all of the frontage of Lake Ontario and surrounding territories called the GTA, and in all of that, last year, 2 years ago, I noticed that there was not one plaque or one statement ever made in the entire waterfront that said that there were Indigenous people once living along this area. And that is when we created. I put a houseboat down with the help of my museum. We painted some murals on there, and I talked to the public and made a presence on the waterfront. And David, it was a great day when you came down, and we sat there for a couple hours, renewing our old friendship and talking about there's going to be change. And we're all going to share this incredible city of ours in equally and with thinking about the sustainability of the waterfront, returning it to the beauty that it once had. And we talked about the ravines and the rivers and the work that you're doing with your group of people. So it's turned around, but I just want to set the record straight of the 150 years that led up to the moment we're here now.
Absolutely. And that's such a great learning opportunity for everyone here. So yeah, hearing the history, but also knowing that museum with Wigwam Chichimung and your partnership there, creating that opportunity to learn right down on the water is so amazing. And David, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the ravines and the water systems and how that's all connected, especially I'm sure you really connected with that when you were down there together at Wigwam Chichimung.
Well, for sure. And I do spend a lot of time still with the ravines and the water system. Some years ago, I chaired a rural commission on the Toronto waterfront, on the future of the Toronto waterfront for the federal government and the provincial government. And we made a recommendation that there should be understood that Toronto isn't simply municipal boundaries. It also has a natural boundary. And that natural boundary is the so-called bioregion of Toronto, and all of the rivers and creeks that flow into the lake, of which there are scores and scores of them. Major rivers, of course, are like the Rouge and the Don and the Humber and 16 Mile Creek and so on. But there are all kinds of creeks and waters. It is understanding that watersheds are the lifeblood of the place, and understanding that land use planning and anything you do with the land should relate to the watersheds. Something that Indigenous people, of course, knew a long time ago. Duke was talking about the 1805 agreement for the waterfront and waiting until 2010. And part of the difficulty was, other than the fact there's a little bit of avarice on the part of the colonists, the colonials at the time, was that that this was done by surveys. So for Indigenous people, the idea that you split up the forest by drawing imaginary lines, calling those lots, that was just not part of their understanding of what the natural heritage is about. And secondly, they could not understand that you weren't sharing the land, that you could sever it off and it was only yours and nobody else's. So it was the lack of sharing and the lack of understanding its relationship to water that really caused the biggest problem we've had. So since that time, of course, we've adopted the notion of watershed planning. Since that time, we've understood that we have to pay attention to water. We have to pay attention to nature. It was really a difference between the European understanding of nature and Indigenous people's understanding of nature. European understanding was that nature was to be exploited for its benefits, right? That it was to many Europeans, it was a beautiful but fearsome thing that needed to be tamed and exploited. For Aboriginal people or Indigenous people, they understood nature to be, they were part of it. They were not separate from it. And so it was that collision that held up any sense that we could bring it together. What's bringing it together now is that we have become closer to an Indigenous understanding of the role of nature in cities than ever before. And that is increasing. Indeed, the current pandemic is helping everyone put it in focus.
Absolutely. There were many of us talking about connecting more with the land at this time because everything else seems to be slowing down, right? So,
No, for sure. And
yeah.
so it's a long haul. I mean, we're trying to cramp history together, but it was in the last 50 years, since the Calder case of 1973, since the white paper, since Duke's time as a young guy in Toronto, the whole history of our relationship has changed. And we moved from assimilation, we went to integration, but now we're looking for some kind of conciliation, some kind of inclusion. And someone once said to me, what's the difference between assimilation, integration, and inclusion? And someone said, assimilation is finding out that there's a party going on. And integration is being invited to the party. Inclusion, which is where we are now, is being invited to dance. So I think that's where we are now. We're groping around trying to figure out how we conduct this dance.
Wow, what a beautiful sentiment. And I think part of it is, learning to dance together and learning some of the steps that we as settlers might have no understanding of. And I know that the Indigenous understanding of places has been a big part of that for some, right?
For sure. Duke can go at it. Let me say that it was my own appreciation of the power of place came from understanding more and more how Indigenous people saw place. Indigenous people to this day understand that places are important, have power by what happens there and what happens to them there. They're not simply names given of some duke or duchess, right? That you really understand the power of place by understanding what is actually happening in the place and to you. And that sense of memory, of a mental map of it, is something you pass down from generation to generation. Duke was talking about what do we do with the ravines, and there's a terrific opportunity now. The Rouge Valley is now the Canada's first national urban park, and they're now creating what it's going to be over the next little while. This is an absolute opportunity for Duke to revisit his old speeches and explain to people that there are Indigenous names that can be used all the way along the waterfront. There are stories that can be told, all of that. We need to have another flotilla of Duke Redbirds to keep trucking.
I second that. Duke, maybe you can take us around through some of the language that's used to describe the region.
Well, when you think of what it was like before the colonists got here, with the relationship to Mother Nature, to the land, to realizing that we come from the earth, that we don't have dominion over it. We don't have our relationship with the world that we lived in was what has been called mythic. That is that each small community of related kinship families would take up residence in a territory, and that territory later on became known as the trap line. That world that you were entitled to get your sustenance from, that you lived off of. There was a great forest, which has been called the food forest, that was here in the Rouge Valley, and all the way from Hamilton right down to the Carolinas. In fact, the Carolinian forest was here. It was 7 canopies of wonderful food that was available. Our people were going out and from the big old trees, the walnut trees, the maple tree, we got maple syrup, we got walnuts, we got beech nuts, we got incredible, wonderful food for our brains, because they say the walnut, you crack them open and it looks like a little brain. We knew that walnuts were good for our consciousness. We knew that maple syrup was. We knew that these great trees were protecting all the rest of the plants, and in those old trees, we called them these were the wisdom trees. These were the old trees that had many winters, and they represented wisdom to us. And underneath that canopy of old trees were the more fragile trees that were fragile, but they were able to survive harsh winters and hurricanes and rainstorms and everything. And invariably, they always gave us the fruit of their produce, and they had the courage to stand up to the elements of nature, and they always provided us fruit. So we had courage, wisdom, we had courage, and under those fruit trees were all the plants that were the berry bushes, the blueberries, the raspberries, the thimbleberries, the hawkberries, all the berries. And they were different tastes, they were different shapes, they were different colors, and they lived together. They were all together, and they respected one another. And we learned about respect from those bushes when we looked at them. We had wisdom and courage and respect. And then there was all kinds of food under living next to the berries that were right above the ground, and they were good to eat, and they were honest in their representation to us. We saw the other animals eating them, and we ate them, and we learned about honesty from those fruits. And then on the very ground, with the blanket of the earth, was our medicines. And there we had to go and get on our hands and knees and sort out the ivy oak, the poison ivy from the good ivy, the poison oak from the bad oak, the mushrooms from the toadstools. And we learned about truth. And then you dug under that surface, and under there we found the tubers. And we learned humility from that. And then we saw the plants moving through this great food forest of ours, and the ivies and the grapes and so on. And we learned about how they embraced one another, and we learned about love. And we had the 7 ancestor teachings from this wonderful, incredible food forest that was here. In fact, Forest Hill used to be that food forest. And what happened to the food forest? What happened to all that wonderful food that was providing to us and floating down through rivers with the nutrients and the fish and everything? And we were happy little communities of people enjoying the fruits of it. What happened? Settlers came over. Where is the food forest? In a place called Forest Hill. You know where all that forest is in Forest Hill? It was cut down to feed the furnaces in the brickworks. And now the brickworks, all those old houses, after they cut down the food forest, they built their houses with the bricks from the brickworks. And guess where the beautiful oak trees, the beautiful walnut trees, the beautiful birch trees, and all of that, where do you think they are now? If you go to the offices down at Bay Street, you'll see the walnut, the oak furniture and the walnut flooring. And I mean, it's just what happened. And we as a people watched this go down, and we saw the plows that came along and dug into our mother, the earth. And we were astonished at the horror of it all. Well, that horror has resulted in a time right now where we're facing a crisis of such an immensity. Climate change. We need to change our ways, and we can do it. And we can do it with a new vision. And that vision has to incorporate, in my view, Indigenous philosophy and thought in an equal partnership with the dominant culture. We want everybody. No Native person ever said in all my life in this city, in this country, ever said we want the non-native people to move away. We want, when we said in the beginning when they first came, we embraced them. We kissed them, we embraced them, we hugged them. We said, come and join us in a dish with one spoon. And they came and they took the dish away and they didn't even leave Mrs. Spoon.
That's why Duke's a poet.
Oh, I'm so moved right now, Duke. And I hope everyone here is listening with their hearts and hearing that, because, I mean, what an opportunity for us to learn and to change things. And talking about the earth, too, we were talking about, Duke and I had a conversation about Kiss the Ground, that new documentary that talks about the soil. And you were talking about plowing the soil and tilling the soil, and said that was not even something we did. And for me, with the settler background, that's all I knew. I'm like, well, even if you garden, you dig everything up first. And the power that actually exists in Indigenous peoples knew that you don't mess with it, that you honor Mother Earth, and that you actually steward and care for her and have that relationship with the land. And encourage people to check out that documentary as well, Kiss the Ground. Yeah. And I also, just as a quick side note on that, Duke, when we were talking about language, there's a really beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And that we can put that title in there too, but that talks a lot about the language of animacy, of how we relate. And like David said, that places and things, like, it's not just we're putting a name on a place, it's actually what the relationship is. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about even the name Mississauga. What does that mean?
It means river of many mouths, many river, many mouths. As that's what Mississauga means, and the Credit River used to be known as the Trusting River because because the traders were trading traps and things, and they would get the furs back. It was a trading post along the Credit River, and that's where the word comes from. The trust, meaning credit.
Yeah, they could get credit.
Yeah,
for fur trade.
Yeah,
absolutely. And that's why they're called the Mississauga of the New Credit, because when they changed their location, went over to Highway 6, where they are now, that they just kept the name. That's why you got New Credit.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that. How fascinating. It also makes me think, the understanding of places and how that changes how we relate to the place. But even still, like, a lot of us, we're wrapping our head around what culture is. And Duke, you had a really interesting definition of culture that I think a lot of people might be interested to hear.
Well, culture is anything you invent, borrow, or discover that satisfies your needs. And it's fairly simple when you think of it that way. So Indigenous people living in the urban setting of Toronto, simply because we have borrowed some of the cultural things and discovered some of the things from the diversity of cultures that live in Toronto, just because we use them as well, doesn't mean that we have abandoned that which we discovered ourselves and shared. So culture, I can wear Air Jordan sneakers, and somebody else can be wearing moccasins, or I can wear a top coat, and somebody else can wear a parka. And there's the multiplicity of cultures and diversity in a place like Toronto. That's why it's called the meeting place. We all share a specific culture that is represented by the City of Toronto, by the things that we invent, borrow, and discover in the place that we live. But we also have traditions which are so important to every culture, and every people have traditions that come down through generations and can be practiced at the same time that we're sharing culture with everyone. And I want to say that the new culture, the new discoveries, and so on, which some of them were borrowed from Indigenous views and ways of being, but are now being introduced to the waterfront. The retrieval of the wetlands at the bottom of the Don River, and I hope David will speak to a huge, beautiful, incredible development that is taking place right before our very eyes in the City of Toronto, and is retrieving and redirecting some of those ideas that were here when the settlers first got here.
Yeah, that's very good, Duke. You're absolutely right. If you go down to the bottom of Humber, there's now, since now the last 20 years, was recommended 20 years ago, that we take the bottom of the Humber and release it from the box that we put it in, that canal, and have it work its way down into the lake, so that the delta of the Don, that sounds like a song, the delta, sorry.
I'm writing as fast.
Got that down? The delta of the Don is now going to be roughly where it was 300 years ago, without the canal that was there. And it's also it's there, and the delta is there to protect for what is known as the 1,000-year floodplain, right? Now, that kind of thinking is timeless, and it doesn't fit easily into the older-fashioned European notion that things need to be done now and move forward quickly. So there's a speed, a sense of dealing with time and not just place, that comes with understanding the benefits of Indigenous cultures, because there's a sense of what time and place did, not simply place and not simply time.
So fascinating. Thank you, David. Wow, what an incredible conversation this has been already. We have had a few questions come through, and I'm just encouraging people to, if you go to the question panel down there, you can upvote questions that you'd like to hear the answers to, or throw a new question in, and we can move to those in just a moment. But just before we move to questions, I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts you have on what's really important for us to do as we all move forward together around Indigenous-Settler relations, and also honoring and understanding better the land that we're on. So a question to both of you. Answer as you.
I'll take a quick shot. Understanding any place, whether it's a village in Canada or a city in Europe, or some other place, and it doesn't matter where it is. You really do understand only what's going on if you're willing, first of all, to understand the natural heritage of the place. We tend not to do that in the 20th century and the 19th a lot, because we thought it was simply be bulldozed away or buried or whatever. And that has its value in some things. But generally speaking, we should be understanding the environmental or the natural heritage of the place you're dealing with. Secondly, you need to spend time, as Ron Williamson does with his book, not only the natural, but the cultural heritage, right? Now you take the natural and the cultural heritage together, but if you go back long enough, you will get lessons. It's interesting to note that each generation may be using different language, but they're addressing the same set of facts. So I love to go to new places, but I love to read about them first. Love to hear and see about them if I can, both natural and cultural heritage, and then you can fit the current moving parts into a picture.
Excellent, thank you. Duke, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I certainly am thinking about my great-grandchildren, And I'm thinking about the world that they're going to inherit if we don't change and think more globally in understanding that, first of all, we're human beings and we occupy an incredible home called planet Earth. And the thing that a lot of people don't know is that there were no races in the Americas. There was only the human race. We as a people never subdivided the human race into categories of based upon the color of skin. And today, people still talk about races as though that there is separate categories of human beings, and there isn't. We all belong to one human family, and we occupy one beautiful, incredible planet. And it's the responsibility of each individual to understand that we are all related. There's a wonderful, whenever we say our prayers in the Indigenous world, we always talk about all our relations, which means we are as related to the worm in the ground as we are to the eagle in the sky and to our fellow human beings, wherever they are on whatever portion of this planet we occupy. This planet was put here for human beings, and it was put here to share one dish with one spoon across the board and have to do what nature has wanted us to do from the beginning of time immemorial, which is to be born, raise a family if we want, and eventually go and be birthed into eternity. It's a journey, and that journey that we are on is one that we all share, and we share it and should be able to share it with as much avoidance of pain, and seek a path of the challenges, our talents, our intelligence, and our capacity to be kind, to be people of I'm looking. I lost the word that I was looking for, but it's generosity of spirit, really. So that's my thoughts on this particular subject.
Thank you so very much. Oh, well, I'm going to turn to some questions. We do have quite a few here, so we'll pick them as it kind of flows. There was one actually that said, "Thank you for the fascinating description of the meaning of the name Mississauga. Could you please tell us more, Duke, about the name Etobicoke?"
Well, Etobicoke was where the alders grow. The trees, the alder grow, the alder trees. That was why we call it Etobicoke.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I love how in your poetry, it's so clear.
Yeah, Mimico was where the passenger pigeons rested. That's what Indigenous languages are verb-based. And very descriptive. And unfortunately, I was never allowed to learn the Indigenous language because few people know this, but it was against the law in Canada to teach Native children their languages. All during the 1940s, right up until we didn't even become citizens of this country until 1960. And so I, in my own personal life, I never got to learn my language, but the languages are coming back, and there's a lot of people out there, young people now, who are learning their languages, and you know, it seemed like like the dominant culture feels that they're very generous in allowing us to learn our own language and do our own ceremonies and to engage in what we had for thousands of years. They often say, well, you should be very happy you can actually learn your language in your school system. Can you imagine? But that, I hope, is changing as well.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. There's a few questions about the waterfront. I might pose this first one and we'll flow through a few of the related questions to it in a moment. But David, there's a question that says, what do you imagine for the future of Toronto's waterfront?
Well, you don't really have to imagine much more than going down to it now, because it's already taking shape. There was some time ago, 35, 40 years ago, the waterfront, well, let me back up a little bit. The waterfront that Torontonians knew for much of the 20th century began to change dramatically in the 1960s and 70s. And so the major things that made up the waterfront were absolutely now gone. Sunnyside, the old baseball stadium, et cetera, et cetera. All of that has changed. And in its place has come a new understanding of the waterfront. And that's being shepherded by Waterfront Toronto, which is the amalgam of the three governments under one body, have done a pretty good job in trying to implement the new. The new consists of basically four things. One, we have to make sure, as I was mentioning earlier, we lay down the fundamentals of its environmental realities. Make sure that it works environmentally with water, etc. Secondly, that it should be a place where people live, work, and play. The waterfronts in the past have very often been places where they were working and maybe playing, but not living. We've already moved into, look at the number of people now living on the waterfront, right? Thirdly, should understand that waterfront is connected to its region. So it's all of those 23, 53, depending how you count the size of creeks and rivers, flowing down from the region north of Toronto. Toronto's river valleys are not only in Toronto, they're north up to the Oak Ridges Moraine where they flow from, and the Niagara Escarpment where it flows from. And so the third is to make sure it's part of the region. And finally, to make sure that we've got programs for new generations of Toronto's schools and so on to understand both the natural and cultural heritage. Water and land creates energy. When water meets land, you get energy and imagination like no other place.
Wow. I hope we're all taking notes here. I think that we have some solutions presented to us. So thank you for that, David.
That's all.
There was a question here, Duke, about your involvement in conversations about the sidewalk lab situation. This is the most voted question. It says, now that the sidewalk labs have left Toronto, what steps should Torontonians or Toronto take next? What is the best way to restore the lands and water?
Well, we have to understand a little bit about what the sidewalk lab idea was. It was a system that was going to be identified as a smart city. In fact, the way it was presented was sidewalk labs. Well, when I saw the word lab, I thought of the rats in the laboratories or the white mice in the laboratories, and the way when you began to look at the processes that were going down, it was simply big companies finding a smart way to mine our interior arenas as individuals as we marched our way through the smart city and had all the bells and whistles. But this was simply in order to figure out how to sell us more products that we didn't want and didn't need and hadn't thought of. And so it wasn't, in my view, they didn't want to incorporate ideas of sustainability. What do I think the city should become? I think the city itself should restructure and redirect and repurpose the energies that are here in the imagination, in our resourcefulness, where we put solar panels on the roof of every building in the city of Toronto, where every balcony has a greenhouse on it, and growing fruits and vegetables and flowers. All this real estate that is empty and unused. When I walk down the Bay Street, for instance, and I look at the balconies of all these big buildings, I seldom ever see anybody on the balcony, and I certainly don't see blossoming of flowers and beauty coming off the balconies. And yet, that's real estate that could be helping to redistribute the natural energies of the water cycle, of the seasons. We have to get rid of the fossil fuels, even though the whole city was built on the basis of fossil fuels. That time is over. Now we have to retrieve the wind, the sun, geothermal energies, the water. This idea of selling our water to big companies like Nestle's so that they can bottle it up in plastic bottles and sell it back to us is just so outrageous. And our governments sell our water rights. And now 90 miles from here at Ohsweken, the Six Nations people, the water table has been drained by the big companies to bottle water to sell it back to us. This has to stop, and they get it for pennies.
And not only that, there's people in Six Nations that don't have clean drinking water in their homes. Exactly,
because the water table has been drained out because they set up their drainage pumps and everything outside of the territory of this imaginary line David was talking about, the imaginary line that separates one property from another. And I know that that there is some movement. I think we certainly the federal government announced recently, the other day, as a matter of fact, that at the end of 2021, plastics, especially drinking water bottles and plastics, are going to be banned. But the city of Toronto should have banned it right from the get-go. And the province of Ontario should never have sold our water rights away to big companies to put water in plastic bottles. However, that's just my humble opinion.
Well, we appreciate hearing your humble opinion and
humility.
Yeah. We're absorbing it all for sure. And I think, you also pretty much answered. There was another question about the brownfield situation in Toronto, and brownfields are, of course, where land has previously been developed but is sitting quite vacant. So really, you've also given us the answer to that question and solution there. There's a question here from Stuart Goodings that says, and I'd like to pose this to David: great to see two of my heroes still so active and determined. Many parts of the rest of the country love to hate Toronto. So how can we and the rest of the country, he lives in Comox, BC, learn to love Toronto and benefit from your collaboration?
Well, hello, Stuart Goodings. It's amazing. I think that I used to make a joke about it, that just hating Toronto is the one thing that kept the country together. So it was not without benefit. But I mean, I think if you're big and you've got your relative wealth, there's always a kind of animosity coming your way. but it never really bothered me. I represented Toronto in many places in Canada and even beyond Canada, and I didn't represent Toronto, so I never saw it as a great big problem. I used to feel, quite frankly, that even those who were wanting to be against Toronto because it was sort of good for their work, secretly wanted to be in the same room at the same time. So I think that Toronto just has to keep on doing the best that it can to be what its best is. We're not a world-class city in the sense that some people mean it. I don't know what a world-class city is. We're not New York. We're not Amsterdam. We're not any of those. We're Toronto, and we have a whole other world to which we can work and fashion. We create a Toronto out of Toronto. People will admire that. If they think we're copying somebody, they're not ever going to admire that.
So, the humble opinion from former Mayor David Crombie about the city of Toronto. Did people hate Toronto when you were mayor?
Oh, sure, but not really. I mean, there were some who got their satisfaction in life out of it, but not very many, because the truth is most people have some relationship with Toronto. They know people who they were either raised here or their kids are here or whatever. They have a connection. And so those connections usually belie the old category of Toronto is this or Toronto is that. I'm just doing a little piece of a book now on Toronto in 1945, right? A very different place, right? And there's no doubt at that time, people thought that Toronto was just an arrogant, boring place. They used to say, it must be wonderful to die in Toronto. You don't have to stay there another day. So, because it was locked down. Now, I was 9 years old in 1945. I thought it was a great place. Yes, there was no Sunday. Yes, they locked the swings and treated, but we played hockey in the pond. We played like Humber Marsh, Grenadier Pond. There was a whole life. So I'm never impressed with arguments that somehow there's a type of thing you can take in New York or any other place and just label it, and it brings any wisdom to you. It doesn't. You have to dig a little deeper and understand what I've been saying, the natural and cultural history of the place. And as Duke talked about, the attempts to refashion the place with a green infrastructure.
Well, and even as Duke talked about the ancestral teachings, right? When we embrace humility, not just as you two speaking with the amazing wisdom and knowledge and experience you have, but all of us, humility about who we are and our relationship to Mother Earth and also to other cities. We don't need to puff ourselves up. We get to have the opportunity to really discover more by being humble and connecting, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's the connections that make the place, for sure.
There was so much when we think about it. When I arrived in Toronto in 1962, and Yorkville was the place to be. And when you think about the energy that happened over in Yorkville, as David knows, was once a little town that was on the outskirts of Toronto proper. And Yorkville was where small houses where the working class folks lived. And when the hippies came in, can you imagine sitting on a street and on any given day or evening, if you're going into a coffee house, there'd be Joni Mitchell sitting in one corner, Leonard Cohen across another way. There'd be Murray McLaughlin coming down the street. There would be Gordy Lightfoot walking along. Blind Lemon Jefferson was over here. Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. Hi, Sonny. Hi, Terry. That was Toronto. Toronto was the place to be. There wasn't a place on the continent at that time during those years of when Yorkville was central to some of the greatest songwriting, the greatest poetry, the greatest art. And we found out from the hub here in Toronto, all over the world. And some of the greatest artists right now that run when you think of the Hollywood stars or the comedians that came out of this bouillabaisse of talent and innovation and creativity, and this city was a hub and still is functioning in that capacity. And yes, people could complain about Toronto as they were putting on their boots and packing their bags to head where? To Toronto.
Good for you. All those people were playing at the riverboat.
Yeah, absolutely.
I whiled away a few of my hours there. Oh, yeah. Man. Yeah. But it's interesting. If we just talk a second about connection, because many of the people who came up to Yorkville came from the old village along Gerrard Street.
Oh, I remember that.
The Gerrard Street village in the 50s and very early 60s but all of those right over from Yonge Street over to University Avenue, both sides of the street. That was the old village, and it was being redeveloped. And all of those people moved north. The Artists 11, Jack Bush and Harold Town, and all of those people, all the musicians, they moved out of Gerrard Street up there. The only reason I mention that, it's just not arcane history. There's a life to cities as there is to towns, as there is to peoples and to language. And you got to pay attention to the fact that you're involved in a process. The river keeps running. It's not just a picture, not a black and white picture. It's a movie, and it keeps moving. And so even Yorkville had its roots in the old village in Gerrard Street. Yeah. So when it comes to what we've been talking about, the idea that we could talk about a Toronto or a Toronto waterfront without any real understanding or appreciation of what went on for the thousands of years before the Europeans got here, is too bad. It was so narrow. But on the other hand, it's getting better.
It is indeed. Yeah.
There is. We have a few more minutes and a few more questions we can go through. One of the top questions here from Danielle says, being in early childhood, how do we help start to change the generations to help them understand how to include the importance of Indigenous learning besides just Orange Shirt Day? There's so much information and history to pick from. And if I may, I might just give a really quick plug. The way that I met Duke was actually through an interview that I did with the Gord Downey and Chani Wenjack Fund. And they actually have legacy school resources that are available to educators across Canada if you go to the website. So you'll have more where it's beyond just Orange Shirt Day, but all sorts of resources around the true history of residential schools, but also everything around how to engage and reconciliation guides for engaging with local community. And Duke, you and I had a great conversation there. So do you have any other recommendations on how people can, especially educators, be able to help those future generations understand and connect with the importance of Indigenous learning?
Well, the first place to start, always, or a good place to start, is in the food that we eat. And few people know that there'd be no tomato sauce on your spaghetti dinner if it hadn't been for the cultivation of tomatoes, because tomatoes come from the Americas here. Potatoes, there'd be no French fries at McDonald's if it hadn't been for Indigenous people cultivating 3,000 different varieties of potatoes. But more than that, some of the other things that were cultivated only here in the Americas that we gifted to the world were peanuts and maple syrup and pumpkins and chocolate. There'd be no chocolate in the world, and there was none before the settlers came to the Americas. Beans, popcorn, herb gardens, peppers, corn syrup, freeze drying. You know, the native people were freeze drying centuries before it caught on with the modern culture. Sunflowers. Zucchini, vanilla, pineapples, avocados, blueberries, cashews, the list goes on. In other words, 70% of the food that is eaten in the world today, in our world today, was cultivated by Indigenous people thousands of years before settlers came here. So they're like chili peppers. There were no chili peppers in the rest of the world. So peanut butter and all the products from peanuts came from this continent, but no one ever gave us the credit and our people the credit that we deserved in relation to what our people cultivated and innovated, and we did it in a sustainable fashion, and we did it in a way that honored the Mother Earth. So we start there, and then we can. When I'm talking to little kids, little children in a classroom, 6 years old, I say, "Does anybody speak an Indigenous language here?" And none of the children will put up their hand until I say, "Well, that's odd. I forgot the name of an animal I saw running along the street. He had a little black mask and rings on his tails, but I can't remember the name." There's one of the 5-year-olds was a raccoon. And then I say, "You do speak Indigenous language. And what else can we think about?" "Oh, the stripes on a little, I see little ground. Oh, chipmunk. These words that we are using every day: moccasin, parka, canoe. The design of the canoe is a chemung, and that's why my little houseboat was called Chi Big Chemung Canoe, sitting on the waterfront.
Oh, I can't wait to sit on that boat again with you. Soon, one day soon, more than 6 feet apart, maybe. One final question that I think Maria asked a couple questions, and there's two here. Maria, I'm going to choose your second one because I think it's relevant, especially as we're talking about learning Indigenous language and how do we actually start to understand, respect, integrate aspects of Indigenous culture into our everyday. And one of the things that comes up often is land acknowledgements. But I sometimes hear different dialogues about land acknowledgement. So there's a question here that says, what are your thoughts on land acknowledgements? Are they important, meaningful, helpful at all? And if not, how can organizations make them so?
Well, the land acknowledgement, the tradition of land acknowledgements was, I'm living in, say, Mississauga, and I'm traveling down and I'm going out to Niagara Falls. So when I arrive, I take with me a pipe and some tobacco and maybe some other gifts. And I arrive in a territory, and the first thing I do is announce who I am, Duke Redbird, my home territory, which is Saugeen First Nation. And then I acknowledge that I am a visitor in the land of the people that I arrived at, and I bring my pipe and I offer that I would like to share my tobacco and my story and my journey, and I want to acknowledge that the land that I'm on is the territory of the people that I'm visiting, and that I necessarily admire naturally the great stewardship that they are following in honoring their mother, the earth, and it's a beautiful way of land acknowledgement, and that's what it was about. It wasn't about ownership of land. We didn't own the land, but it was the ownership associated with our stewardship. And today, I would like to see a land acknowledgement that covenants us, and we have a covenant with the earth and with our mother, the earth, and say, we covenant to be good stewards and to look after you and not harm you and not make this world so difficult that it's not fit for human existence.
Wow.
I can't do better than that, and I wouldn't, and I wouldn't try. It is the first thing that came along that now you see it repeated by lots and lots of people almost everywhere. And at least what it does, as a minimum, what it does is remind people that there was a history that we were talking about earlier that was there for a very, very long time, very, very long time, and has some wisdom to impart. I mean, what it really is saying is, I'm here, happy to be here, recognize that you are here before me, happy that I'm sharing, thank you very much. That's what it's about.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know how anybody can be against that.
Well, I think, again, it comes back to what we spoke about at the very beginning, which is I ask people to listen with their hearts, but it's also acting with our hearts. So when we are giving a land acknowledgement, are we connecting first, understanding the land, really respecting and honoring the people who've been here so much longer, and then, acknowledging that relationship and connection. And I think that if we're leading from here, then we can do well. And Duke and David, both of you have had a lifetime of leading from here, and it's really made such a difference. And for you to share with us today in the way that you have, it has been such an honor to listen, to learn, and to, be part of this conversation. And a huge thanks as well to everybody who's been part of it today, everyone who's tuned in, those that might catch the replay. And those that ask questions. MyZM will be sending resources out and notes and things for us to follow up. But I'd like to turn it over to Jeremy for a few final words just to say thanks and wrap us up. But Duke and David, this has been phenomenal. Thank you.
A pleasure. Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Thanks so much, Audra, and thanks everybody for joining today. Duke, David, Audra, a wonderful, spirited discussion. You're talking about listening and engaging with the heart. I think there's so much for us to reflect upon, not the least of which is getting started on your lyrics of your new song, David, Delta of the Dawn. So we'll get started on that. There's always something to leave you with to do more for us. Thanks also to the Department of Canadian Heritage, as well as Lisa Balfour-Bowen for your generous support of this Wigwam Chi-Chimung series, and Nancy Wolf for your continued valued partnership and guidance. Before we go, I just want to remind everybody of some of our current and upcoming programming at MyZM. One is something called our Quarantine Capsule, which is a digital archive of the Asian Canadian experience during this COVID pandemic, brought to you by T-Base in partnership with MyZM. As a time capsule of the quarantine period, we're looking for creative contributions from all members of the community. And we hope that you'll be able to join us on Wednesday, October 28th at 7 p.m. as we host an event called Quarantine Capsule, Archiving Asian Canadian Stories. There'll be an online discussion about the significance of the Chinatowns in our everyday life and the importance of archiving the Asian Canadian voices. Secondly, we have recently launched our next Intersections Festival call for submissions. The 2020 festival is going to happen in 2021. So this call for submissions is for the 2022 festival. The festival explores intersectional perspectives of Toronto through collaborative exhibitions, events, experiences, and then presents a wide array of programming intended to create a dialogue on civic issues and inspire a deeper knowledge and appreciation of our city. For those that have attended Intersections Festival before, you're getting something different every year. So we're really excited to see what people have come up with for 2022. The chat function in the Zoom has been very active today. So I hope everybody's been following it about more information about not only what you and David and Duke have been talking about, but some of our viewers and audience, and then some of our team as well. So thank you for keeping an eye on that. Of course, find out more information about who we are and what we do and what we're about to do on our website, mymuseumoftoronto.com, and all of our social media channels. Please also consider subscribing to our e-newsletter list. I'll keep you up to date on everything that's going on. And also consider making a donation to MyZM. We want to ensure that these programs continue to be free to the public, and any donations from the public will help us continue to do that. Finally, shout out to my incredible team for all their hard work in putting this together, and our board of directors for their continued ongoing support. So we'll leave it at that. Well, thank you again, and appreciate everybody spending some time with us today. David and Duke, it's as advertised and then some. So we're really happy this worked out, and it was such a wonderful experience for everybody. So thanks, and have a wonderful day, and we'll see you again very soon down the road.